Howdy Class 7, this is Ms. White, here to tell you about the skeletal system and muscular system as part of the research component for your prosthetic hand project. So here we go. You should be taking notes as you watch this presentation. We're going to discuss the 5 main functions of the skeleton, the role that joints play in the body, and the main characteristics of bone. Some key terms to keep in mind include the skeleton, vertebrae, joint, ligament, cartilage, compact bone, spongy bone, and marrow. The skeleton is the inner framework made up of all the bones in the body. Something that should be fairly familiar to you. Most of you have probably seen an image like this showing all the bones of the human body. You do not need to memorize these bones. Some of you may have already, and that's perfectly fine. Kudos to you, but you don't need to know them. And there are 5 main functions of the skeletal system. The first is that it provides structure and support for the body. Think about your body without a skeletal system. You would look like a giant blob on the ground. You need those bones there to keep you upright in the face of gravity. Go ahead and feel your backbone. The scientific name for backbone is your vertebrae. There are 26 vertebrae, individual bones that make up your spine, and they help keep you upright. So that's a good example of support. Second function, it protects the internal organs. For example, the ribs protect the organs in our chest, such as our lungs and our heart. And the skull protects our brain. Third function is that the skeletal system enables you to move. Muscles attach to the bones, and they're what make movement possible. And we will focus on this in a couple of slides, so stay tuned. Fourth function, the skeletal system actually is responsible for producing blood cells and for storing minerals such as calcium until your body needs them. Any place where 2 bones meet in your body is called a joint. Joints allow the bones to move in different ways. Without them, you would be rigid and unable to move. There are 2 main types of joints. The first you may not have heard of. It's called a fixed joint, and as the name implies, these joints do not move. And the best example of this are the immovable joints, or fixed joints, in your skull. So here's a picture of your skull. And if you can trace these outlines, you'd be tracing the immovable joints in your skull. When you're born, each of these pieces are separate from each other, and in between them are bits of cartilage. So those bones are actually floating around, but held roughly in place by cartilage. If you've ever heard an adult tell you to be very careful with a baby's head, that's because it has these gaps where there are no bones, so it can be easily damaged. As you grow, the cartilage fills in with bone, eventually to the point where the 2 sides meet really strongly, like this, and by the time you're an adult, your skull has these fixed joints here. Movable joints are the opposite. They move. And let's take a look at some examples. One type is called a hinge joint. We see this in the elbow and the knee. And a hinge joint more or less allows for up and down motion. So bend your elbow, bend your knee, back and forth. It's only moving in one direction. It's not really moving from side to side. Ball and socket joint, we see these in the shoulder and the hip. And this allows for a very large degree of motion. If any of you are dancers and do, I think they call them fan kicks or rainbow kicks, that's the ball and socket joint at work. If you've ever pitched a softball the correct way, that uses the ball and socket joint too. Big range of motion. Pivot joint is what we see in your neck, and it allows for back and forth movement and almost the full range of motion you see with the ball and socket, but not quite. It's a bit more limited. And then the gliding joint is what we see in the wrist and in the ankle. Let's take a look at some of these. So there's a hinge joint, ball and socket, pivot, saddle we're not going to worry about, and gliding. Let's take a closer look. Hinge joint allows movement up and down, back and forth. Saddle joint we won't worry about, but that's the specific joint of your thumb. Gliding joint in the ankle. Pivot joint in your neck. Ball and socket joint in the hip. Okay, let's try out some examples and see if we can match the correct type of joint to the motion. So say you're moving your arm around in a big circle. What type of joint would that be? If you said ball and socket, you are correct. Remember, you're right at your shoulder. That allows you to move your arm in a circle. What about this one? Doing a deep knee bend. Hint on the knee. What type of joint is that? If you said hinge joint, you are correct. Waving your hand. So not with your whole arm, not the princess wave, just like a normal wave. What are you moving? You're moving your wrist. What type of joint's in your wrist? You said gliding joint, you're correct. Let's try this one. Grasping an orange in your hand. So you grasp it and you squeeze it. So think of how the fingers are moving. This will be important for your prosthetic hand. So your fingers are squeezing. We're going to call those hinge joints. So at your knuckles, your fingers are moving in a back and forth sort of motion, similar to how your elbow and your knee moves. And finally, twist your head from side to side as if you're saying nope. What type of joint is that? You said pivot, you are correct. All right, let's look at a joint and talk about some of the tissues we find there. Bones on a movable joint are held together by a very strong connective tissue. Hint, hint, we've seen connective tissue before when we learned about the 4 types of tissue. This particular type of tissue is called a ligament, and I'm sure many of you have heard of these. For example, your ACL, if you tear your ACL in your knee, the L in ACL stands for ligament. And in this picture here, here's a bone, here's a bone. It's as if they cut the bone in half through a cross section. And this white, tough tissue is connecting this bone to this bone. So ligaments are for bone-to-bone connections. And they're tough enough to allow the joint to be strong and withstand shock, but at the same time, it's flexible enough to actually allow you to move. So it's a fine balance. Cartilage is another type of connective tissue we see in movable joints, and it covers the ends of the bones. So here's it in blue, and here's the other bit of cartilage. And it's extremely important to have cartilage there because it prevents these bones from grinding on each other When that happens, when you grind down the cartilage too far and you start to grind bone on bone, that is called arthritis, and it's extremely painful. And the cartilage also allows you to absorb shock. So if you imagine that this is your femur, so the big bone in your thigh, and your tibia, the bone in your shin, and you're running, lots of force coming down on that joint, but the cartilage helps absorb it. So again, ligament, bone to bone, cartilage in between the bones. Now, believe it or not, bones are complex living structures that are undergoing growth and development. They're living tissue. They're not these dead things we carry around in our bodies. Any of you who have broken a bone and remember how much it hurts can tell you that it is a living tissue. Here is a cross-section through a typical bone, and we see that it's made of 3 major components. One is the compact bone lining the outside. The second is the spongy bone, which is beneath that. And then here, the yellow marrow, and there's actually red marrow as well, 2 different types, but that runs through the center of the bone. The compact bone is on the outside, and it's hard and dense. However, it's not so dense that it's completely solid. It actually has these canals with blood vessels that run through it. And so if we were to zoom in on some of this compact bone, we would see these canals. Here's one sticking up. And look, there's little itty bitty blood vessels running actually right through the bone. And the reason that's happening is because the blood carries nutrients that are important to get to the bone, and it carries away wastes from the bone as well. The spongy bone has small spaces in it, as you can see with these circles, and it is lightweight but strong. The marrow, the goop on the inside, has 2 main functions. The red marrow produces blood cells, and the yellow marrow stores fat in your body so that if you undergo a period of starvation, your body can draw upon those fat reserves for energy. We're going to do the muscular system. So the muscle is an organ that contracts or becomes shorter. And we talked about muscle tissue, and how it had that banding in it, and that banding structure allows the muscles to actually change shape or change length very quickly. 2 main types of muscles. One is the voluntary muscle. You can control these. An example would be the muscles in your face when you smile or when you talk, and all the muscles in your arms and your legs for walking, running, skiing, whatever you're doing. Involuntary muscle is muscle that you cannot actively control. So for example, your heart muscle is involuntary. You cannot sit here and say, heart, I want you to beat at 45 beats per second. Okay, go. Instead, the brain is in total control of that. The brain and actually the heart itself. Another example, muscles in uterine contractions during birth. So there's muscles in your uterus, and when those contract during birth, you don't have control over that. Your brain does. And finally, all the muscles in your digestive system that squeeze food through, you don't have active control over that either. You can't say, stomach, stop digesting. Doesn't work. Here's a table that summarizes some information about the various types of muscles. We just talked about involuntary versus voluntary. And let's start over here with the voluntary muscle because we're more familiar with it. The formal name for it is skeletal muscle, and the reason it's called skeletal muscle is that this type of muscle attaches to the bones of the skeleton. And the connective tissue that attaches it is called a tendon. So remember, ligaments attach bones to bones, but here tendons are attaching muscle to bone. So you'll find tendons at the ends of the muscles, and then they stick onto the bones on either side. And they allow for movement. And we'll see an example of this in a second. There are two types of involuntary muscle. One is called smooth, one is called cardiac. The smooth muscle lines the walls of hollow organs, such as your stomach and your intestines. And this part is wrong here. The function of involuntary muscle are many. One function is to squeeze food through the intestines. Another function we talked about earlier is the uterine contractions to give birth. So those are two examples you can talk about. This part is incorrect. This should be up here. Sorry about that. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart walls. Cardiac, cardio, heart. And its main function is to pump blood. Pretty simple. We're going to take a look at skeletal muscle next. This is the type of muscle we're going to focus on with our hand prosthesis because your hand movements are voluntary. Okay. Here's the thing about muscles, and this is a common misconception. Muscles can only contract, meaning that they can only get shorter. They cannot actively extend or lengthen. You and I both know that you can contract and extend body parts, such as your arm. Right here, this person is contracting the arm, so bending the arm towards herself, and then extending it here, or lengthening it. And the way that this happens is that muscles are arranged in pairs, opposite each other, so that when one muscle is contracting or shortening, it's pulling the other one to relax to its original length. It's not that the other muscle is actively lengthening. This one muscle's contraction is lengthening the other muscle. Let's take a look at a good example. So everyone, feel your bicep. That's the Popeye muscle, eating your spinach, arr. And then the tricep muscle is what runs below your biceps. So bicep, tricep. Look on either end of the muscle is a tendon, and it's connecting it to the bone. When you want to bend your arm this way, so bending it this way, your biceps contracts or gets shorter, so it squeezes up like this. And in doing so, it lengthens the triceps. When you then want to lengthen your arm, stretch it out away from your body, your biceps does not actively relax. Remember, it can't do that. All it can do is get shorter. It can contract. So instead, what happens is your triceps gets shorter, so it pulls this way and this way. Let me get a pen. This will help. So it's actually pulling like this and like this to get shorter. And in doing so, that unfolds your arm and lets it extend, and it extends the bicep so that it stretches out like this. So again, moving your arm up, biceps contracts like this, gets shorter, stretches this out. You want to then extend your arm, the triceps contracts, which lengthens the biceps. It's not the biceps going, okay, I'm contracted, now I'm going to extend. Nope, triceps extends it. A quick bit of review, and then we're done. Something that students confuse often is ligaments and tendons. And with good reason, they're both connective tissues that have to do with the skeletomuscular system. So take a moment and think about this one. What is the difference between the two? You can look back at your notes. I'll give you a minute, then I'm going to show you the answer. Okay, let's take a look. Remember, a ligament is connecting bone to bone at a joint, whereas a tendon is connecting the muscle to the bone. Okay, here ends the notes on the muscular system and on the skeletal system. You have now a lot of the background information you need in order to better understand the prosthetic arm project, prosthetic hand project rather. And so your next step is to explore some more of the resources, look into the anatomy of the hand, look into different prosthetic hands that have already been made, and start to brainstorm some ideas for you and your group. Good luck!